Thank you for joining me, Tanya Andricks from Crossing Healthcare for Mental Wellness. Mental wellness is a time where we have an open dialogue, an honest and frank discussion about mental health issues that are real and facing the people of our community. We're trying to bring professionals to you so that you can listen to us talk about these things and hopefully garner some information that you will feel practical and helpful as we all navigate this pandemic and winter. So today I'm excited because I am being joined by two professional social work staff on the Crossing team. We have Rebecca Armstrong and we have Charmaine Robertson Stoner joining me today. And these two ladies have both worked in the field of social work for a lot of years. We're going to talk about adolescent mental health and mental well-being. And I know that's a topic that is really top of mind right now because so many kids are learning from, remotely. So we thought it would be a good idea to have this conversation. I want to start with you, Rebecca. Rebecca, tell us a little bit about yourself, your professional experience, and how many years have you been taking care of the kiddos of Decatur and Macon County? I think it is important for you to share that with those listening today.
Okay, my name is Rebecca Armstrong. I am a licensed therapist. I have been working with the Decatur youth for approximately 10 years, both here at Crossing and at a previous Heritage. And I've worked in a variety of settings here in the clinic, in the schools, and out in the community. So I've had a lot of experience. I've met a lot of kiddos over the time.
I know you have, Rebecca. I think that, right now you probably have your finger on the pulse of these kids, as well as any behavioral health professional in the community. And then Charmaine, welcome back. Charmaine joined us last week. Charmaine's a licensed clinical social worker. How many years have you been in social work? I think it's important for you to share that with those listening today.
Sure. I've been in the field for 11 years. So that's pretty hard to believe, but 11 years now. Absolutely. And worked with an array of patients during that time.
Yep. And I know you've also, in your experience, worked with adolescents and youth. And so both of you come with a great deal of experience. And so I want to just dive right in. I think that it's important to frame the conversation right now at the very beginning. That this dialogue, if you're listening, it is for parents and caregivers. I think we're probably going to talk about this from the perspective of the parents. There might be a time where we have a dialogue or a conversation that's really aimed more at adolescents. And that might be a good idea for a future discussion. But right now we're going to talk about this as caregivers, as parents, teachers, and talk about really what we can do to recognize issues that might be coming up from a mental health perspective for adolescents and sort of where to go from there. But first of all, Rebecca, could you start with, when we talk about adolescence, what age range are we thinking here? What are we talking about? I want to be clear about the population that we're having the conversation about right now.
The age range with adolescents, what I typically think of is like 11 and 12 till about 18. So those school age kids that are in middle school to high school.
Right. So I think it's important to frame it. Our middle schoolers and high schoolers have been really facing this pandemic in such a different way. First of all, talk to me, Charmaine, I'll start with you. What do you think the challenges for middle school and high schoolers have been sort of top of mind from your perspective since this pandemic really started in February, March of 2020?
Sure. Yeah, I think probably the collective experience maybe for the overwhelming majority of us is that our world has literally been turned upside down, right side up, and maybe shaken up a little bit in between. The world is so different than where we were even, last year this time, in our country and just globally. And so then we sort of narrow that scope down, and now we're talking about with our kiddos and our adolescents and what that means for them. The implications for their education and all of the, the e-learning. And I know Rebecca will talk a lot about that. What that now means for us in terms of connection and our friend group, socialization. What does that even look like? Safety, connection, How do we manage and balance the two? We've talked about this in the past, but I think obviously as adults, we struggle with navigating through that, let alone to be an adolescent. So you already have some hormonal things happening at the same time, right? And then you have life happening and friend group and things with your education, and you may be at the point of learning how to drive or, trying to get your first job. There's a lot of development that's happening standalone, like within itself. And then we just throw in a global pandemic at the same time. And so I think there's certainly a lot to be said for that. And of course, what does that mean for my mental health and or substance use? What does that look like as well? That coping, that escape, that isolation, sort of that we talked about last week.
So thank you, Charmaine. What are you seeing, Rebecca, here in our community when you're talking to adolescents and you're talking to the parents? What what's bubbling to the top as new or more heightened problems in this age group that have come as a result of the pandemic?
Well, I am a parent of two adolescents. I have both a middle schooler and a high schooler. I think the biggest hurdle right now is the e-learning and being able to navigate technology with parents lots of times that don't know how to do it. I mean, the kids know more than the parents, and they're trying to get onto the Google Meets. We have kids that aren't even participating in the classroom opportunities that they've been given, some just because they can't, others because they have lost the will to, and even others that don't have the technology to even do it.
Right. So there's that. What's happening as a result? Are you seeing increased anxiety amongst the kids? What are you seeing with adolescents? So the big problem seems to be school, and that's their number one job. When we think about adolescents, then their job is school. And so we'll start with work. So their job is school, and they're being hit with all these challenges, these frustrations. Are you seeing anxiety? Are you seeing depression? What are you really seeing from a mental health standpoint amongst adolescents, or what should parents be watching for?
I'm seeing a lot of both. I always kind of tell people that anxiety and depression are kind of like ugly cousins. They come together, and the more you feel that lack of drive to do stuff, then especially with school, you get behind, and then you have the anxiety of, oh, I have 50 assignments I don't have turned in, and it just kind of snowballs from there. Mm-hmm. Kids that don't want to do anything, lots of anger, lots of eruptions, lots of family conflict.
Okay, sounds like reality for a lot of people's homes right now. So Charmaine, talk to me a little bit about what might be signs of anxiety or depression that parents should be looking for in their kids right now. So we know the trigger is probably going to be school. We'll start there. What are signs that that you are seeing increased anxiety and depression?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. One of the things that I think we typically see the most with our adolescents is there's sort of this disconnect. There's a disconnection of some sort. Maybe parents felt like they had their finger on the pulse. Some folks, we might have discussions about parents feeling disconnected from their children, not really knowing what's going on. And some folks might feel like, nope, that's not me. I pretty much have a good idea. Except this year we've struggled greatly. And so maybe, my kiddo or adolescent is isolating more in their rooms. Or maybe, because on one hand, we're talking about you need to sort of isolate, but on the other hand, we're saying let's find creative ways to be connected and sort of social. And so that can be a mixed message for teens, for kids, for adults as well. The other thing I think is there's some classic things, right? So when we think about functioning with adults, we have to also have that same thought process with our teenagers who may just be less verbal, right? Or less tolerant or a bit more moody. So is my teen still eating well? Are they still able to, go to bed and wake up on time or so, right? With prompting, are they able to get up? Oftentimes parents or folks might say they're struggling with sleeping. I think for us as therapists, we kind of want to dig deeper and know what that means. Does that mean getting to sleep or staying asleep? Because I think it matters. What's their routine like? We talked about in the beginning how it's still important to sort of have a routine. But I think, we might want to rephrase that to say it's important to create or develop this new routine based upon what our current situation looks like now, because nothing is normal, right? We're sort of operating in this new norm still, even in 2021. I think we always have to look at functioning.
So I think what I hear you saying is when parents are trying to discern what's normal pandemic behaviors because they are in their rooms because they're e-learning in their rooms. So what's normal isolation and not things to pay attention to are normal patterns and also eating and sleeping. So how are they eating? How are they sleeping? Those basic functionalities to see if there's disturbances there. Is that what I hear you say?
Absolutely. I think we have to go back to the basics frequently and to sort of be a baseline. And then we go from there with, individualizing it for our kiddo.
So say we're parents of adolescents, it's been a hard year, and maybe our kids were doing well at first, and then we started to see some disturbances, some changes. Rebecca, you mentioned this, but I think with adolescents, it seems like it's one end or the other of the extreme. They either isolate and you never see or hear a word one from them unless you go and like knock down the door and like force a conversation, or it seems like it's these outbursts and eruptions, right? So maybe you start to see one or the other of those signs. Is that the point where you start to ask your adolescent questions about eating and sleeping? Because that might be something that as a parent you might be able to observe, but you also might have to ask. Would you say that's a point where you have to start having those conversations?
Definitely. I think probably the easiest way to do it is just do simple check-ins. I mean, ask your kid how they're doing, how their day was. I encourage parents and families to eat together, at least one meal at night, so that you can have that check-in opportunity and you can see, hey, my kid's appetite's really low, or they're not staying at the table with us very long, or they're not. Another great way is to ask their interests, be interested in what they're interested in, take an interest, show some, and admit to, I mean, we're all human too, admit to them that you're struggling too. I mean, kids, especially teenagers, will relate better if you're just really real with them and admit, hey, I'm a person, I'm struggling with this. I know you guys are struggling, because they have less control than we do.
Yeah, Rebecca, I hear you there. I think that one of the things that a lot of families face is changes in schedules. Not all families are on the same sort of work schedule. And I think the classic having dinner together in the evening is a goal for a lot of families, but not realistic. But what I also hear you saying is just plan a check-in every day. And it's interesting, I work in healthcare. So over the course of my career, I've had lots of different shifts. And I remember when my oldest son was in middle school and into high school, we planned a nightly conversation and we called it that. And it was the check-in, and it was the same kind of thing. We didn't have dinner together all the time because, life seemed to happen. But I think a daily check-in should be a goal of parents. Do you think that that's probably the number one goal when you're trying to make sure you have your finger on the pulse or you're staying connected? Because we're talking about, hey, connection's the first thing. Do you think that if you were to choose one thing, that would be it?
Definitely. I really do feel like that is probably the easiest way to spot if something is wrong or they're really stressed.
I think the next question, Sharon, I'm gonna ping this over to you, Charmaine. So say we're doing our check-ins and they're not okay. First of all, how do you know how not okay is not okay enough to get help? And then how do you have that conversation with your adolescent? Because it's a tough thing. So first of all, when do you decide that it's time to call the family doctor or see a therapist with your adolescent? What's that look like?
Sure. Fantastic question, right? So now as a parent, we've created the space for open, honest dialogue. Fantastic. And during that open, honest dialogue, your teen is transparent with you and they say, I am struggling. I've been, if we really kind of want to talk about some things that I think have been very true for our teens during the pandemic, it would be thoughts of suicide, just to be completely transparent about that, or extreme feelings of hopelessness, which is not always the same as suicide. So I think that's really important to note. I think when parents hear certain trigger words, maybe, which I think it's great, it should kind of like raise a little flag for us. I just want to give up. I can't do it anymore. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I can't connect with my friends. I'm having some dark thoughts. Whatever those sort of words might be, I think it's important to sort of tune into them. So then the parent hears these words, and I think it's really important for the parent to first of all say thank you and acknowledge that I'm very grateful that you shared this with me. I want to work with you to come up with a plan of action, because I think just in my experience in working with teens, when they feel ganged up on, or they feel sort of like this intervention is coming at them, that's a good way to get them to shut down. So if we want them to shut down, that's what we can do. I think if we are trying to facilitate a healthier, collaborative response, then I think we really make every effort to work with them. What I am not saying is that there will not be times where parents kind of have to make the hard decisions. And that might look like, the teen saying, well, I don't want to go meet with Dr. such and such. And the parent saying, but I think we're at the point that we at least need to. So this is what I'm asking you to do. Here's my ask. My ask is that we just schedule, we go. Maybe we don't make a next step after that, as long as you're able to keep yourself safe, but we at least come back, have a conversation, have a plan of action. If you then have thoughts, or those thoughts continue, then we have to be honest with each other and regroup. I think as much as we can sort of facilitate this collaborative approach, teens, just like adults, right? We kind of want that sense of empowerment, that we have some choice, we have some autonomy in our lives. I think that's a part of the first steps. And then you work with your providers and your kids.
Wow. I want to unpack that. You just gave parents a lot of really good information. First of all, we're having our daily check-ins. And now as the parent, I'm starting to hear some what you call trigger words or phrases that are just different or darker. So it's hopelessness. It's a loss of feeling of wanting to continue. It might be, I'm not sure I want to keep living, all of those kinds of phrases. So as a parent, those are really, really hard things to hear. And so what I think I heard you say is don't freak out, don't get upset, say thank you for sharing that with me, right?
Yes.
So we're checking in. We hear things, we hear things that scare us as parents, but this is the moment in time where we take a deep breath as a mom or a dad or as a caregiver, and we just say thanks for talking to me.
Absolutely.
Yep. And then after we do that, then I hear you say it's time to call the doctor, call the therapist. So when we're hearing those trigger words, it is time to call. And Rebecca, I want to take this over to you. So, Charmaine gave one example, but when it's time to see the therapist, that's different words to hear for different teenagers, right? So as a parent, we've heard the trigger words. We know we're going to get this kiddo in for help. How do you suggest that conversation goes with an adolescent, saying it's time to seek help? How do you have that conversation with your teen?
That's a hard conversation to have first, because you're afraid as a parent, because you've heard these things, and you have to be brave. But I think if you offer to, we can go see this person, this therapist, this counselor, phrase it as, I'm going to go with you. I'll be in there with you. If there's things that you want to talk to the therapist alone, that's fine. When I have adolescents come in, I always have both parent and child come in and kind of give me a history of what's going on, what brought you in here. And I think lots of times for a lot of adolescents, coming in to the therapist is like the worst thing ever. But by the end of the session, they really have this platform where they can be empowered, and they get to give their parents a kind of a glimpse of, this is my life. This is how I'm feeling. these are things I can't normally say in a regular setting, but I can here because it's safe.
That sounds like so much of what we talked about in our previous conversations here in our mental wellness talks about how oftentimes going to see a therapist or seeking help like that seems so scary. And most people, once they go, feel heard. And once you feel heard, you feel valued, and you usually leave the interaction better than you came into the interaction. So a lot of times, just that first appointment's the hard part. I think that um, a good approach is the honest approach, saying, this is what we're going to do. And I love what you said, Charmaine, about we're not looking past one appointment. We're going to go once, and then we're going to have an honest conversation back at home and decide what happens after this. And I think that after that one appointment, most of the time, adolescents will feel heard.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's really important for parents to have and practice. I'm going to say practice unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard. So when I open up the opportunity for my teen to share whatever they need to share with me, regardless of what they say, I'm going to have unconditional positive regard, meaning there is nothing that you're going to tell me that's going to make me love you any less. That's going to make me accept you any less. That's going to make me value you any less. What I ask is that you give me sort of the opportunity to work alongside you so that we can help each other really during this process, because I think it's important, as Rebecca noted, for parents to, within reason, but to sort of be transparent as well that, yeah, I'm struggling too, right? There's been a lot going on. And I don't by any means mean to hijack the grief or hijack the trauma or the stressor. I think it's important to note that I'm struggling because it sort of creates this space of, okay, I'm not alone, right? There's this inherent feeling of isolation, I think, that teens feel frequently. And I think, Rebecca and I have seen a lot as well. And I will say, I just wanted to add, I do the same. So whenever I meet with adolescents, kids for the first time, I have the parents back. And I think it kind of creates this sort of safe space. But usually by the end of that first session, I want to have a moment with the teen alone. And maybe that's the like child welfare thinking in my brain as well, where you sort of want to check in with the teen or the kiddo alone to see if they're willing to see, is there anything else that you'd like to share with me today that you feel comfortable sharing with me today? Just when parents not in the room. And I mean, I just think that's important to note. Kids naturally want to please their parents. And so if I was to 100% tell you my truth, the thing that they've sort of convinced themselves of, and I can't say that they're always wrong, is that you will look at me differently. And that's the reason why the parents sort of need to respond with that unconditional positive regard, that regardless of what you say, I'm here. And I don't have all the answers. Be transparent about that. Be vulnerable. The V word, let's be vulnerable with one another, because you're asking them to be vulnerable. So I think you mirror vulnerability. I don't have all the answers, but I bet you what, we'll work together and we'll work to try to find some reasonable solutions.
I really am glad that you brought that up. And I think that this is another fear factor for parents, because, that's who we're talking to today. And that is this has been a hard year, and I don't know a home that's perfect, right? And so I think sometimes parents are even afraid to introduce therapy or getting some help for their adolescents because they're fearful of what that adolescent might highlight that's happening in their own home. And that is, again, that vulnerability, that in order to help my adolescent, it might mean that, some of my own struggles as a parent or our own struggles as a family may become part of this conversation and likely need to come and be part of the conversation. But that is why this conversation we're having here today on mental wellness is so important.
Yes. And then we're going to model for our kiddo to stay out of the shame zone, right? So I think just like we talked about last week, meaning we're going to practice this. I'm saying modeling it, but I really mean we're sort of practicing, but they're watching us. And so if they know something's going on in home and it sort of comes up, and the parent kind of shushes it away, or no, we don't talk about that, and our business is our business, and we're here to only focus on you, as if the environment doesn't have an impact on them as well. Now what we've done is sort of shame them, we've silenced them. And we've modeled that this is a disingenuous, we're not being authentic in this moment. Okay, so I'm supposed to please, perform, and perfect, which is exhausting, and it doesn't exist. So I think this is a really good opportunity to say, there might be some uncomfortable things that come up for me, that come up for you, but I really want you to focus on you. I don't want you to be concerned about me in this moment. You're why we're here. And if there's a sort of a ripple effect with the home dynamics and the family, then let's work on that.
That's perfect. What do you have to say about that, Rebecca? Because I'm sure you've seen a lot of that. Sometimes parents are afraid to get help for the kids because they're afraid of what might come up. Any other thoughts on that in and of itself, where you've seen it all end well? Because we've got to be brave with this.
Like Charmaine said, kids are always watching, even when we don't think they are and we don't see them. They're listening, they're hearing, they're watching what we do. We are their greatest role models. So we have to walk the walk in what we say. As far as I think the biggest struggle lots of times in family dynamics is communication. So if you're open and honest about communication, that can only make things better.
This is tough. And so, we're here today on mental wellness, talking about adolescence. And, we've covered a lot of ground here so far. We all know that kids have struggled. They're e-learning, they're isolated. It's hard enough to be an adolescent anyway. And you add all of this to the mix. We know that our teenagers are having problems as parents. And so the first thing we talked about, again, is the check-in and the daily check-in, because that's just your way to keep your finger on the pulse. And it doesn't have to be dinner, but that's a good time. But just, if you haven't already started that, figure out a way. For me, one of my kids, it was a nightly conversation. It can be a morning talk. It can be a walk with the dog every day. Just pick something and do it with your kid every day and have that 5-minute check-in. If you start to hear trigger words, if you start to hear things and phrases that are dark or show hopelessness or show suicidal thoughts, it's time to get help. And that means seeking the help of a therapist. So you can call your family doctor or you can call a therapist direct. And we talked a little bit about that. And then the next thing it sounds like you two are suggesting is committing or getting your adolescent to commit to just that first appointment to start with, because if you present too much more information, they may not be interested in that appointment. Did I hear that sound pretty correctly, Charmaine?
Absolutely. One appointment. Yeah. And I think, honestly, it is imperative for us as adults to really be intentional about working through our trauma, our stressors. Mm-hmm. The thing that I've seen to kind of be the most devastating, I think, is when parents have had traumatic experiences during their childhood and their adolescent is crying out for help right now. But because the parent has had traumatic experiences, which is valid and it matters, they sort of become the barrier. I've seen them sort of become the barrier versus the vehicle to change. And it's obviously the number one thing the parent doesn't want to do, right? This is in their minds, they're protecting their child, right? I had this experience, so certainly they're going to have this experience. And so I've had to have some really honest conversations with parents and also just processing with them. Talk to me about the last time you stepped foot on an adolescent psychiatric ward. Oh, well, it was 20 years ago. Okay, let's talk about that. It matters. I think let's pin it. But going back to, it's important to still be mindful that your kid is crying out for support in this moment. And now is not the time for us to sort of make this about ourselves, right? It's really important to maintain the spotlight on the kiddo. So it's really imperative that I think we as adults, as parents, kind of really are intentional about working through some of our own things. And if my kid needs it, even if I don't quite understand it, but it might be a matter of life or death, and I'm not minimizing that. then I think that we sort of take a step back and you do the thing that you do as parents, you put them first, so that they can get the support that they really want.
So it's really two-pronged. Parents have to be willing. First of all, they may not want to have their adolescents seek help because they don't want things exposed in their family. So you have that sort of set of issues that might get in the way. And then the other set of issues is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, that sometimes parents, once they start this process, make or shift the focus to the parent and not the adolescent. So you've got two ends of the spectrum that we want to highlight for those of you listening to this conversation right now, that can get in the way of your ability as a parent or caregiver to help your adolescents. So you have to really watch for both. Expect that first appointment to include you as the parent, but also expect that first appointment to exclude you at the end, to give your child a voice. And you have to be okay with that. And I think for some parents, that's the hardest part, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's relinquishing control, right? What is that? We don't do very well with that, just as humans, period. And then when we've sort of really grown when you realize you never really had the full control in the first place. So it's easier to sort of relinquish, but yeah, absolutely.
Well, if you're just joining us, we're having a conversation here about mental wellness, talking about adolescence and adolescent mental health. Adolescents are top of mind right now because we all know how hard it is to be a teenager. And adding the pandemic and the isolation and the e-learning and everything that goes with that, I think has made it even more difficult for our teens. And so we're trying to have an honest conversation, present some practical information for parents on how to know. And I think we've really done a good job of, okay, how do we know what a problem looks like? But I want to shift gears to a little more difficult discussion to have. And that's surrounding suicide. We talk about teen suicide sometimes, but it's a tough topic. Recently, we're seeing on social media more and more conversation about adolescent suicide and death by suicide as it's associated with particular mitigation efforts that have happened as a result of the pandemic. So, schools have not been in person learning. Students have not been able to participate in extracurricular activities of all kinds, from theater to sports. And it's been tough for kids. I think that so many times our adolescents' identity becomes very wrapped up in whatever their sport or their theater, whatever their talent is or whatever their like is, it becomes a huge part of their identity. So when that's taken away, I think it sent some kids spiraling. Can we talk a little bit about just sort of the trends that we're seeing and sort of what is probably underpinning death by suicide now in the adolescent population, and what maybe it's not, and what might just be sort of popular to say on social media. So I'm gonna ping this to you, Charmaine, to start this conversation, and then Rebecca, join in. Let's talk about this difficult subject.
Sure. Yeah. Rebecca and I were sort of having a discussion about this earlier in the week. And so I'm looking forward to your feedback as well, related to the increase of teens actually completing suicide. And so we sort of have to, it requires a deeper look at attempts versus, completions, and versus ideation. Like, I was sort of having these thoughts, but I have no plan to ever act on them. Or I was having these thoughts and I attempted, but I wasn't quote unquote successful, or it didn't happen, or what have you, or completion. And I think it's important to talk about maybe the accidents in there as well, because it's not always an intent to complete suicide. There's so many variables. And again, I think now transitioning to life online, it certainly makes me question what that process looks like with cyberbullying, and what implication does that have in kiddos' feelings of self-worth. And I think it plays a role, and what, to what degree and all of that, I think, who knows, right? I mean, we're talking about the online platform, we're talking about household functioning or dysfunction. My household is either functioning well and there's space created for someone to pause and say, hey, is everything okay? Or we're so busy and caught up in our lives that no one ever really checks in with me. There's a question that there's a game that I play with parents and kiddos kind of as an icebreaker when we have sessions together. And one of the questions is, if I did something well, who would notice? And it is powerful for teenagers to answer that question. It's also just as powerful for parents to answer that question as well. And for teens to kind of hear that response from parents. I had one mom cry once and said, no one, and I saw this level of compassion from her child because mom was also feeling very overwhelmed as well. Again, mirroring that it's okay not to be okay. We don't have to go around, right? The meme, it's fine, everything's fine. It's okay if it's not fine. But yeah, I think we have to think about the household implications, the friend group, really this online platform. We've preached for years that, okay, not too much online, let's limit that. And now this is kind of the way of our world. It's the way we sort of stay connected. How does that impact teens?
Let me break this down a little bit because this is language that you as social workers are pretty used to using, but maybe us parents who aren't social workers might not be as accustomed to it. And so teen suicide's this big sort of topic. But what I heard you say is it starts with the suicidal ideation. So that's just thinking about it, and not having a plan. So that's sort of one bucket, right? And then I heard you say successful versus completed. So these attempts, do you think that the increased isolation might be taking people from the ideation to the next level of attempts, but not serious attempts, to successful completions? Do you think that maybe we just are seeing, again, same kids who probably have completed now were probably just, having less meaningful attempts previous. And because of this isolation, we might be seeing just the continuum change. Do you think it's
absolutely. There's a quote that goes, "The lies of depression can only exist in isolation." The more I'm isolated, the louder the voices, and I've talked about this before, not necessarily auditory voices, but sort of that self-defeating negative thinking. I'm worthless, I'm not worthy, maybe I'm too fat, I'm failing, I'm a failure, or repeating some things that maybe they've even heard parents say out of maybe frustration, or they're tired, or but that's what happens the more we sort of isolate. And yeah, I think that's certainly a contributing factor. Rebecca, you had thoughts. Oh, okay.
Rebecca, let me hear your thoughts.
I definitely believe that with teens, especially because their social group is everything to them. That's their number one priority, what their friends think. I mean, it's obvious even on like social media, like Facebook and TikTok and Twitter and all them. It's all about how many likes you get or how many streaks you have or who is liking this. And this social isolation where they don't get to go to school and hang out with their friends. And if they're having a bad day at home, they can go to school and talk to their friends and they can build them back up and be like, yeah, I understand and all this. That is really giving them more of an opportunity to complete suicide. I don't know if necessarily the trend is worse because suicide has been trending up, especially with teens for the last 10 years. But this complete isolation of nobody at school is seeing them. Lots of times parents and schedules are hard to maneuver time together. It just gives them more opportunity to complete.
And I think that is why the advice for the daily check-ins is such powerful advice. It seems so simple. Sometimes the simplest things, are really the most important things, but it feels like that daily check-in for a thousand reasons, is so very important, especially when it comes to this is if your child really is struggling, that daily check-in could be the difference between a completion and a failed attempt. That daily check-in could be the difference between the disheartened attempts, the cries for help versus just the ideations with no plans. This is a continuum, and the goal would be to work your adolescent back down that continuum is what I think I hear everybody saying. One thing that's been used as an argument on social media to get sports started back up and to get, all of these things back up is that, that not having sports has contributed to suicides. But I think a better way to say that is isolation is contributing to completions of suicide, that because people are isolated, it's the isolation. And whether we're able to start sports, it really depends on how this pandemic plays out. Right now, the day we're recording this podcast, things look good. But a month from now, we may have to tighten up restrictions again. And so I think it's important that parents don't decide or associate whether or not my child can play, hockey or, baseball is the difference between, a suicide completion or not. I think it's what is a better way and a more empowering way for parents, because parents don't have control over whether their kiddo can play football or hockey or whether the school will let sports open back up. But a more powerful, empowering way to say it is, I can check in and I don't have to. I can support my child in this time of isolation, even without sports. Does that sound like a better way to have that conversation? Because it's a real sort of conversation playing out in our social media right now.
Yeah, I think it's finding other ways to have healthy outlets, right? So this entire pandemic, I think, has forced us to become creative, and we've risen to the challenge. I think, from educators to healthcare workers. We've frontline workers, restaurant owners, we've sort of risen to the challenge. This is no different. I think it's sort of finding creative outlets in other ways. When I oftentimes when we have these discussions, I give out the crisis text line, but I think it's important which I think that number is important to say again, which is 741-741. Oftentimes folks don't know about that resource. So we know about the suicide prevention hotline, but not necessarily the crisis text line. If you ever have an opportunity, I would encourage you to just Google TED Talk crisis text line. There's a story behind it, and it was really inspired by a teen. The crisis text line it wasn't meant to be a crisis text line. There was this entirely different mission. They transitioned to becoming a crisis text line because a teenager reached out and expressed that her parent was abusing her. Hello, is anyone there? Does anybody care? It kind of gives me goosebumps, but does anybody care? And so they went, whoa, we have a mission almost far greater, right? Like there's kids, there's teenagers who's suffering. And so, this teenager was sort of the development, the inspiration behind this crisis text line. And anyway, it's very powerful to watch. But I think when we talk about teens and that they, maybe text more than you talk on the phone and things like that, it's kind of like, a counselor in your pocket, and just reaching out and saying, I'm struggling today. There's an algorithm, and depending upon what the person, the teen, the adult says, maybe puts them at the top versus the bottom. And so things like that, it's really important. I think, yes, in moments of crisis, but also maybe even in moments of maintenance, just an additional resource, an additional tool.
Absolutely. And so I think that would be a number that would be important to give to your teen, because they are more comfortable with texting. A text line for a teen is probably a really important resource. So if you are identifying, your child struggling, that would be a great resource to give them. And that doesn't involve you. And sometimes teens want to circumvent their parents, and part of that's growth and development, or part of it maybe there's some dysfunction in your home, and that's okay. We're not shaming. Lots of homes have some struggles, but at the end of the day, even in our homes where there's struggles, we still want to protect our kids and their mental health. So the daily check-ins, making sure your teen has the text line, really do make sense. And I think the other thing, when we talk about suicide and the dreaded conversations, I think that really combating isolation, which is hard to do in a pandemic, has to be the priority of the parent. And I think that's why parents have been quick to say, my child can't play sports and that's what's causing increased teen suicide rates. Your child isn't playing sports and that was their connection. So now our job as parents is to find creative other ways for connection.
That's really hard for parents because I know my two kids played sports and it ate up a ton of time. Like when we didn't have practices and didn't have games, we had all of this time that was just void. So what did you do with it? I mean, personally, we got a Netflix account and started watching things together, just common interest. But I mean, if you don't have those connections with your kids prior to, you don't have those protective factors, that's hard to just start and be like, okay, sports was our only connection or theater was our only connection. And now what do we do? Our hands are kind of up in the air and you have to be creative on the spot. And you got kids that are, especially teenagers, are like, oh, that's not going to work. Or I don't want to do that. That's stupid. And you have to.
Good old fashioned family game night again. No.
Yep. I think that is truly, I think that's a clarification that I think it's important for us to make. If you're just joining us, we're wrapping up this wonderful conversation on mental wellness, and we really had a great conversation talking about adolescence. And I do want to, close out the conversation, making sure Rebecca and Charmaine, if there are any other sort of jewels or things you'd like to share, because both of you have been therapists for more than 10 years. You've sat with adolescents in your office and you've sat with families. What can you say to parents right now as they're navigating this adolescent time frame? What would you tell them from the wisdom of the therapist chair? Charmaine, you're first.
Okay, I'll go first. I think let's create the connection. So those check-ins that Rebecca talked about, let's create the space. Let's then hold the connection. So your teen tells you something very uncomfortable. They tell you something very vulnerable. And as maybe triggering as that may be, or as heartbreaking as that may be, respond with kindness and love and appreciation and unconditional positive regard and a collaborative spirit. Let's work together to try to help you to feel better. Like the simplest term, let's work together. Here's some of my thoughts. Let's commit to one time, one session, and then let's regroup. So create the connection and then hold the connection.
That's great, Charmaine. Thank you. Rebecca, what would you offer up to parents at this moment?
Definitely, I would, if your child is coming to you and saying, I am hurting or I don't feel like this, I need to talk to somebody, definitely take that opportunity. If they're not that willing and you've noticed changes, and you will know, you're the parent, you know your child best. You'll notice these changes, then have that conversation and be willing to walk through the fire with them. Just be able to be like, we can do this together. We'll go together. I tell parents and kids in my office in the first session all the time, when we do all the, like kind of the dirt part of it, at the end, I go home, think about it. If it's not for you, then fine. But my door is always open and I'm always here.
Thank you, Rebecca. And that's what I think is so important. We've got resources in this community. There are absolutely great therapists, and reaching out to your family doctor is a great way to do it. But if that is something that you can't make work, there are crisis text lines, 741-741, right, Charmaine? Right. And a Google search online will show you resources as well. So take those opportunities. And, I hope that parents can set aside their own sort of worries and concerns for a moment. I think it's hard to be a parent of an adolescent. It does require you do a whole lot of self-checking. But at the end of the day, I think that when parents walk right next to their adolescent through these challenges, sure does develop a deeper relationship. And so I can see it as an opportunity. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today as we had a good, I think, practical conversation about adolescent mental wellness. I hope that you can join us again in the future as we, again, bring relevant real-time mental health conversations directly to you. Thank you.